Friday. Okay? All right. Well, no further ado, Professor Tonga.
All right. I have the pleasure of introducing our lunch keynote speaker to maintain the balance. We had Professor Crenshaw obviously talk yesterday. We now have Professor Valerie Purdie-Vaughns, an assistant professor in psychology at Columbia University, formerly of Yale University. She has done really remarkable things, and whether it's the stereotype threat stuff or the other science that she's done, the science stuff has really been interesting, but in part what she's going to do is to talk beyond just as a scientist, right, and to actually try to think about the themes that were obviously raised in the prior panel, to connect the role of law and social science together to see how one might flow into the other in responsible ways. So I think we'll see a connection of the themes in a nice way, and the fact that Valerie can talk about both fields with facility and has already personal experience working with law faculty makes her a wonderful person to think hard questions that you saw ferreted out in the first panel that will continue to be the topic of discussion for the rest of the day and going forward. So please, let's give a great round of applause.
I'm just going to move this up a little bit. Can everyone hear me? All right. I made Jerry promise not to attack me here like he attacked all the other speakers. So I'm going to start. The title of my talk is Colorblindness and Social Science, Are We Relevant to the Law? And I have to start out by making somewhat of an apology that Saul and Jerry said that we should think big and very expansive, and so I gave this expansive title before actually writing the talk. And so I'm actually going to focus probably more on psychology, which is my area. But one of the things I'd like to do is to throw out a bunch of different ideas, and then the other sociologists and political scientists and economists in the room can kind of join in the conversation. But most of the time I'll be talking at the level of the analysis of psychology. Okay. So to begin, if ever social scientists could point to a moment in history when social science had an important, powerful, and lasting impact on the law, it was the landmark decision of Brown versus Board of Education. This is what we as social psychologists mostly point to. Charles Hamilton Houston was considered the primary architect of the Brown versus Board of Education litigation strategy, and he intentionally and personally harnessed research from the behavioral and social sciences as evidence against a separate but equal doctrine. Specifically, he used psychology studies, and they're now they're famously called the doll studies, were used to demonstrate the effect of racial awareness on the psychological health of black children. So very quickly, for those of you who don't know, he had black children come into a laboratory one at a time. They had a series of dolls. You can see the dolls are either white dolls or black dolls, and they could quite simply show them the dolls, allow them to play, interact with the dolls a little bit, and then just ask which one is nice, which one is pretty, which one is like you, and showed that black children continuously and persistently would select the white doll when it came to the nice ones and so forth. And so these studies were used as proof that segregation causes lasting psychological damage, and that separate but equal could never, in fact, be separate and equal. So fast forward to 2007, just last year, and here social scientists can point to a moment where social science did not seem to have an impact on the law. It was in another Supreme Court case, and this is the landmark decision of parents involved in community schools versus Seattle School District Number 1. Again, social science was part of the litigation strategy. Here, as evidence to support the use of intentional racial balancing interventions, the school district was using to ensure that schools remained integrated. So in short, social science here was used to argue against racial isolation. So the powerhouse was much greater than in the 1950s. Over 50 social scientists were cited in one of the amicus briefs. They sort of advanced many arguments, but the two major arguments were that the importance of racial diversity in reducing racial stereotypes, and also that meaningful contact between minority and majority group members could not happen and was unlikely to occur without school district intervention because of unconscious biases and the sorts of things that we've been in conversation about today. So here, more research was cited. The research was empirically stronger, but ultimately less persuasive. Now, so certainly I'm not here to say that Supreme Court cases, or indeed any cases, are won or lost solely on the basis of social science data. But this anchoring of time by Brown versus Board of Education on the one hand, and the parents involved in community schools versus Seattle on the other, allows for an intellectual moment of reflection to think about the role of social science and the use of empirical data to inform jurisprudential thought. So here, what I'd like to do with the time that I have, and I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, I'd like to address two questions in the hopes of stimulating conversation and actually furthering the conversation and the interesting questions and debate we just recently had. And so the first question of interest that I'm going to address today is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of social scientists? And specifically, I'll mostly focus on psychologists, and how can critical race theorists increase our relevance to the law? So in my opinion, social psychology is in a powerful moment of reflection, right, in this time, this moment where we are here today. New methods of physiology, neurobiology, psychopharmacology, and behavioral genetics are sort of moving us lockstep more and more towards a very individualistic way of thinking about the person. And certainly the funding is moving in that way. And so we can very nicely move in that direction, or we can reclaim the social context and these structural variables that historically were central and dear to those of us in social psychology as a discipline. But as Professor Crenshaw made clear yesterday, this is also an important and perhaps historical moment for critical race theorists as well, but for different reasons than Kim discussed. This group of scholars, again, in my own opinion, have begun more than any other legal movement to utilize social science data and theory to advance arguments around the effects of race and racism on the law. And the use of social science data raises important questions about the effectiveness of the use of empirical data as evidence to both further legal scholarship and to advance bolder legal arguments in court. And so this leads to the second question, which is, how useful is our data to critical race theorists? And so with that, what I'd like to do is try to move through my talk addressing both of these questions. Many of the issues that you all were just talking about several minutes ago, I'm going to raise and hopefully try to provide some structure to in my talk. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question. What are the strengths and weaknesses of social scientists, and how can critical race theorists increase our relevance to the law? And so we as psychologists have several important values. We are valuable to you as critical race theorists and as legal scholars, and I want to sort of outline what those might be in my opinion. The first is that I believe that we identify important variables and constructs that have not been previously identified and demonstrate that they have powerful effects on social behavior. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Two, that we are very good at, our discipline makes us good at designing and testing interventions that can produce social change. And three, we can provide what I would call empirical traction to theories that are already advanced in the law, and we can provide empirical support for those theories. And so I'm going to sort of break this down and give a couple examples of each of these points. So first, the idea that we identify important variables and constructs that have not been previously identified and demonstrated that they have powerful effects on social behavior. So as social psychologists and as psychologists, we study mental function and we study the behavior of individuals. And while political scientists and economists and sociologists and so forth have very elaborated and sophisticated views of structure and for example, poverty and these very high-level variables, oftentimes they have a very impoverished view of the individual and how the individual moves about the social space in daily life. And so one of the things is that we have very rich and elaborated, maybe sometimes too complicated, but very elaborated theories about the person and how they operate in the social space. We also study micro models of macro problems. So we can take things that are very, very sort of grandiose, almost too difficult to grapple with at one time, whether it be poverty, whether it be immigration law, whether it be parental rights. We can take these big issues and we can go into our laboratories and we can model very closely what happens out there in the real world in our laboratories. And perhaps the biggest and sort of most, I think the biggest thing that we as psychologists have is the ability to buy you or provide you with causal inference. That we can show with our series of experiments that we can show that the effect of some kind of predictor influences an outcome in a very clear and causal way. And third, because we focus on the social context and the individual together, we can really talk about and try to bring life or breathe life into this idea of mutual constitution. And Kim talked about this yesterday as well, the idea that there's a person and the person moves about in society, but the society is also acting upon the individual, and so the two mutually constitute each other. So we could talk about the person as they move through society and how the society in turn affects the individual. And so these are the things that we're actually very good at. So let me give you just a very specific example. This is one chart that demonstrates one of the most trenchant and enduring issues of our time, and this is the racial achievement gap. This is just one demonstration of this in using data from LSAT scores. On the y-axis is mean LSAT scores, higher numbers reflecting higher LSAT scores. The bars going from this way are there's Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans. There's always this interesting group called other, and whites. This is data of over 27,000 individuals, and it doesn't take a statistician to see that the biggest discrepancy in LSAT scores in 1991 of over 27,000 people was the difference between black students on the one hand and Asian and white students on the other. Also that there's a fairly large difference between Latinos and whites as well. So this is just one example of the racial achievement gap. This is a very big and enduring social problem. A related social problem is the underperformance of minorities. So some people can say, well, look, there's these differences, there's these static differences between black and brown individuals and whites. But here, another and related social problem is the issue of underperformance. So even when you have two people, one black and one white, for example, that walk into, say, a law school or walk into undergraduate education, and they are equated on all sorts of different variables. They both have, say, 1,000 SAT. That 1,000 SAT score will buy the white individual by the end of their 4 years an A, and the black individual a B. And so these two things together are one of the social problem space that, that many of us across many different fields live in. And so what are some of the explanations for this achievement gap? So the explanations of this could go on and on and on and on, and they could range from what I would consider the absurd at this point, related to IQ, skills and preparedness. Maybe it's the case that these folks just don't have their act together when they're coming there. Culture of poverty, we're so sorry, but they just don't have the money, and only if we could change the social stratification in society, we'd be able to improve these test scores. Lack of role models, the teacher salaries, unions, on and on and on. If I asked everyone in the room, everyone would have a different explanation. Not to say that these explanations are not valid, but they focus on a certain level of analysis. And as social psychologists, we have been able to inject into this conversation a very different kind of variable. And this is based on research on stress that's been very prominent in psychology for over 50 years. Just stress of being in evaluative situations, all kinds of evaluative situations, whether you're standing at a free throw line or you're trying to, just be the best person you can be in society or drive a car or what have you. But if you take this sort of basic relationship that stress causes anxiety, that causes choking, and you apply it to the racial achievement gap issue, you then get this very interesting phenomenon that my advisor and now colleague and friend has well articulated, the idea of stereotype threat. That when you are in a situation where there is the heat of a negative stereotype, here in the case of African American students, that this added pressure has the potential to lead to underperformance. And so my point is that when we're talking about underperformance, or we're talking about these achievement gaps, that the tool of stereotype threat, or the tool of psychologists, is that it helps us to understand the immediate context and how it impacts the individual. And we can show that the immediate situation of contending with negative stereotypes can have an effect on the individual. So it's not that these other broader structural levels don't matter, but when we think about the law, they want to know, what is the immediate situation? What is the immediate consequence? And we as psychologists are very good at identifying what that situation is. Also, as psychologists, because we're focused on the sort of the immediate social situation and the intermediary between the individual and the social context, it points us to straightforward, cost-effective interventions that can focus on the psychology of the person as they're interacting in the environment. So this is just one example of how we are capable of identifying these variables that were not identified before and bring them to bear on important social issues. Second, we're very good at designing and testing interventions that produce social change because we understand the laws of experimentation. And not to say that other fields don't, but this just happens to be one of the things that we're very good at. And I want to give you an example of some of the work that I've been involved in for the past 3 years. I just laid out some of the issues around the racial achievement gap, and one question that I've been very interested in, and my research team and several different research teams around the country, is how can we attenuate, how can we shrink that gap? And if we can do that to any significant degree, this could have a very big impact on the lives of African American students. And so the work that we've been doing has been drawing on self-affirmation theory. Again, a very basic idea out there in psychology. The idea that if you can sort of draw upon your own sense of self-worth, not necessarily self-esteem and feeling good about yourself, but your sense of worth and your sense of value, that this can, in a moment of stress, it can sort of reduce the psychological threat and allow you to perform. So very, very real example. I so believe in this work that I do this all the time. I was extremely nervous, particularly that Jerry's going to say all kinds of antagonistic things to me. I'm sitting in my seat, I'm very nervous, I have a computer on my laptop, and so I just casually start sort of thumbing through pictures of my 1-year-old daughter. And so in this moment where I am concerned about being evaluated and co-opting all kinds of legal terms and so forth, the sort of heat of being in this moment can be reduced by, for me personally, thinking about my daughter. And so this is the logic of self-affirmation research. And so I've been involved in a program of research that's been applying that very tool in the domain of writing exercises in a series of experiments with 7th graders in an actual middle school. And we focus on middle school because age corresponds with a downward trend in performance. All kids in middle school, every one of us in this room, kind of tank out in middle school. And oftentimes for minority students, it's very difficult to recover. We've been doing this research in an economically middle-class school district. And it's just fortuitous that the student body happens to be 50% African American and 50% white. There's pretty much no other racial group there. And so we as psychologists know that if you tell a teacher that we're going to give an intervention that's actually going to be helpful for the students, this in of itself can help explain any kinds of differences in performance. So we don't want to do that, and that's one thing we don't do in the experiments. The other thing we know is we tell students, look, this is for you. This is going to help you do well. It could have one of two effects. It could actually increase performance, or sometimes in the case of minority students, it can actually backfire. So we don't do that. The interventions that I'm going to talk about are actually smoothly integrated in the curriculum. The teachers know that there's some kind of project that happens throughout the school year, but they don't actually know who is in the treatment condition, who is in the control condition. The students don't know as well that they're even in an intervention because their parents signed them up. So in the affirmation condition, we have students, we ask them to write about an important value, and I'll show you what the worksheet looks like. We randomly assign by a flip of a coin. We can just split the room in half, or better yet, randomly assign, flip of a coin, treatment or control. They're all sitting together just like this, and they engage in a series of very deep writing exercises for approximately 15 minutes. It looks like this. This is the front of the worksheet. It says the most important values to me are athletic ability, or being good at art and creativity, and these are kinds of things that young people say that are important to them. They circle one or two. And then we have them write essays, and we say don't worry about spelling or what have you, just do your thing, just write it as best as you can. And the teachers give these instructions. We're not even anywhere in the school when this happens. And this is just to give you an example of 3 African American students in the treatment conditions and the essays that they wrote. One wrote, "Art is important to me because it makes me feel calm. When I'm very upset, like I'm going to cry, I sit down and start listening to music or start drawing a picture." Another excerpt from an essay, "If I didn't have creativity, I'd be bored out of my mind." A third, "If I didn't have my family, I wouldn't be raised right, and if I didn't have my friends, I would be a boring person. If I didn't have my religion, I wouldn't know what to do. I would be lost." And these are 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds, and you can see that these are very powerful and sort of self-generative, and we don't have the opportunity, black or white, to engage in this kind of access to the self in a school setting. So of course I wouldn't be showing you data if, in fact, the intervention didn't work. And what we find, because we know this, right? And I'm going to talk about that narrative later. So what I'm going to show you is the end of the course grade at the end of the first quarter. So this is 8 weeks out after the intervention. And this particular intervention was done in social studies, but we now have done it in all sorts of courses. On the y-axis is grades, and this is between about a C at the bottom and a B plus is a 3.5. And what we find is for the white middle school students, the white bars are the control condition, the blue bars are the treatment condition. There is no significant difference between how whites are doing as a function of the intervention. So for African American students, what we find, and I find this personally remarkable because of the narrative about writing and how writing isn't particularly useful for people of color, what we find is that there is a significant and substantial attenuation of the achievement gap, such that black students in the affirmation condition do substantially better than black students in the control condition. I won't show you too much more data on this, but we've now replicated this 4 years in a row. It's a very consistent effect in the school. What I do want to show you is another way of looking at the data. Here, looking at poor performance rate, which is the percentage of students, white or black, who receive a D or below, who essentially get Ds and Fs. And on here on the y-axis is the percentage of students getting a D or below. And so if you look at these students in middle school before we started intervening, this is the historical norm, just 3 years collapse. And approximately 25% of black students are getting a D or an F compared to approximately 8% of white students. When you look at the control condition, it looks fairly similar. That now we have approximately 16% of minorities are getting a D or F in comparison to approximately 7% of whites. Our intervention has been able to pretty much close the gap in terms of the students at the very bottom, the percentage of the students that are doing an F, getting an F or a D. And so my point here is that we are able to, using the rigorous methods that we've been trained to use, we're very good at designing cost-effective interventions and showing that they matter in real-world settings. Third, I'd like to suggest that we are able to provide empirical traction to theories that are already advanced in the law. Sometimes we're doing this quite fortuitously because we don't even know that there's a theory out there. And perhaps the one that I think is most salient, perhaps most obvious in this particular space, is the seminal paper by Chuck Lawrence, The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection, Reckoning with Unconscious Racism. And so this is a very important paper that he wrote in 1987, trying to make the case that the doctrine of intent, the idea that in order for discrimination to be held in a court of law, that there had to be some kind of intent. It had to be purposeful and intentional. And one way he tried to dismantle this argument is to say that, look, the way the law thinks about issues of discrimination is completely inconsistent with the way that humans actually behave. And the idea that unconscious racism is out there, that even though you have well-meaning people, you can still have unconscious racism. And he sort of very, with amazing foresight was able to articulate this as a theory. And if we fast forward, I'm not going to show you the data because I'm sure you've seen lots and lots of data on the IAT, but if you fast forward to this point in time where we are now, that social psychologists and cognitive psychologists, over 25,000 studies and data points show that, that many, particularly white individuals, I believe the last bit of data from Masri and Banaji show that approximately 75% of whites show some kind of pro-white bias. So it's almost prophetic the way that Chuck Lawrence was able to give foresight to what we now have as empirical data. And so I think we're very good at being able to provide empirical traction to theories that are advanced in the law. And so this is the good news. So we're really ready to celebrate. But I also think that we have weaknesses as psychologists, and we need critical race theorists and legal scholars more broadly. And we need you to help us do two things. One, I'd say emphasize the importance of broadening our levels of analysis, and I'll talk to you about what that means in a minute. And two, to increase social science's understanding of race-based critiques of legal institutions. This is what you do, and this is what we need. So when we think about this emphasizing the importance of broadening our levels of analysis, I'm sort of talking about a couple of different things. First, one of the sort of standard criticisms of psychology in particular is the question of are our effects hothouse flowers, that we are able to create these wonderful, elaborate, interesting effects in the laboratory, and the minute we walk out of the lab, similar to those flowers you pick up at a bodega, they sort of wilt and die. And so this is the issue of whether the effects that we actually get in the laboratory actually matter in the field. And one thing that critical race theorists can do is to sort of help us think through the importance of doing more and more field experiments, and doing research actually out there in the field. And some of the work my colleagues have been talking about here across these past fantastic 2 days, I think exemplifies some of that. But also, and I think that this is something that I know I myself personally and many of my colleagues fall victim to, is that although we're very good at demonstrating that an effect exists, we are very bad at demonstrating the magnitude of the effect in the actual real world. So, for example, if you're thinking about the racial achievement gap, I always find this fascinating when I have conversations with my friend and colleague Rick Brooks, who's an economist. And he'll ask the question, well, how many people or how many students in the state of Connecticut do you think your intervention will benefit? And I'm like, I don't know. And the reason why I don't know this is because we don't think at this level. We don't think at an epidemiological level. We don't conduct cost-benefits analysis to say, in the real world, how much is our effect going to make the difference of the lives of individuals? And economists, this is the level of where we think. And now some people will sort of push back at me and say, well, look, we're not economists, we're psychologists, we're not sociologists, we're psychologists, but if we are going to engage in this space around the law, we need to increase and broaden the scope in terms of our level of analysis and at least be cognizant of this and start to collaborate with people who can address these kinds of questions. And what this requires is a scaling up of research. And so just to give you an example from my own personal line of research, I'm sort of very congratulatory and to be part of this research team on the self-affirmation research. And then an economist last year contacts us and says, oh, can you give us the, your materials? And we're like, oh, no. I don't know about those economists. Okay, we'll give you the materials. Then he's like, oh, well, can you tell us the magnitude of your effects? And we're like, okay, we give him the magnitude of the effect. And we're very pleased with ourselves. We're publishing high-quality research. We have a sample size between 400 and 1,000. And we find out just a few months ago that he's now replicating our study in the city of Philadelphia in 23 schools with over 11,000 students. And so, I'm not bitter. I'm not a hater. But, we had lots of conversations. Do we want to do that? That's too much work. Who wants to be bothered with all those students in schools? Blah, blah, blah. We'll never get tenure. But my point is that, this is the bitter pill is that, this will be the person on CNN, right? But, that's not a, scientific way to think about it. But the way to think about it is that this is a person that can tell us in very plain terms the issue of impact. And this is the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about or just be critical that we're not thinking about it. And so I want to give an example, a very specific example of a conversation that we as psychologists was left out of for the most part. You all's dear friend and colleague Rick Sanders published this very meaningful paper in the sense that there was lots of conversation about this, the systematic analysis of affirmative action in American law schools. And for those of you who don't know about this paper, it's an analysis of several longitudinal data sets on law students and lawyers, specifically black and white law students and lawyers, to conduct a cost-benefit analysis of affirmative action. And there's sort of 2 points he tries to drive home using empirical data. First, that preferences, specifically racial preferences, place black students at a disadvantage. And one piece of data he shows, this is from this data set in 1991, that the median black student starting at law school in 1991 received first-year grades comparable to a white student at the 7th or 8th percentile. So this is a pretty big difference. The second argument that he advances is that low grades handicap black students in efforts to complete law school and pass the bar. So what he's basically saying, and his data shows, that 45% of black students currently graduate from law schools and they pass the bar. And his argument is, look, if we would put black students where they belong and so shift them down one tier, they would actually do better, be more successful, and you would get a bar passing rate and graduation rate of 74%. Now, I am not going to debate the merits of this case or not, but what I thought was extremely interesting is that we as social psychologists, I just talked about this, we have these elaborate theories of stereotype threat and the added pressure of confirming negative stereotypes and underperformance, and we were noticeably absent from this debate. The only reason why I even heard of this is, again, my colleague Rick Brooks was like, did you hear about this stuff? He didn't say it like that. He said, oh, did you hear about this? And I don't want to add the performativity that you don't engage in. And I said, no, I hadn't heard of it. And I read it, but I sort of came through it only because we're friends. And then I come out here for a conference, and this is sort of the hot issue. And so this is something that's in my field, something that I care very much about. But we don't engage in this kind of dialogue, and I think one of the reasons why is because we don't think about a systems level approach. We don't think about what happens if you shift every single minority student in every single law school all across the country down a level. That's just not the level at which we operate. And my plea to critical race theorists is that you're more intentional about helping us to think through those kinds of levels of analysis. Okay, so that's number one. And number two, I think that critical race theorists can help us to increase social scientists' understanding of race-based critiques of legal institutions. Now, this is something that's very basic. This is what you do. The whole project of critical race theory is to provide a systematic race-based critique of legal institutions, and I would argue that most of us in this room, I'll just pick on myself, I don't know what those are. And so to understand sort of the canon of this series of arguments will help us to focus our analyses and our research on the appropriate topics. So questions like, what are the important and enduring issues that are relevant to the law via this lens of this race-based critique of legal institutions? You can help us identify predictors and outcomes that are important to you that we can then use our science to engage in a dialogue with you about. Three, you can help us identify hot topics or future hot topics, specifically by monitoring what's happening at lower courts. By the time they get to the Supreme Court, that's the first time that most of us as psychologists hear about them. But you can tell us what is going to be hot maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. And so, for example, again, I'll just pick on myself, but if I just off the top of my head, I were to think about, what are sort of hot topics, and of course this is not really off the top of my head because I practiced this talk several times, but nevertheless, you work with me, I would say things like affirmative action, and I would say things like jury decision making, and I would say things like maybe employment discrimination or labor discrimination. But one of the things that I noticed, even just in my trolling about the law reviews, is that there's all kinds of things that we just don't think about. Things like parental rights. And when is a child taken away from their parents? This is deeply, deeply racial. And gender, sexual orientation, all kinds of identity issues in there. And this is just something we don't we just don't think about as psychologists. So things like interracial adoption, transnational adoption. These are how much does it cost if you're going to adopt a child, and how that varies by different race, and what's that all about? We don't engage in terms of a psychological analysis of these type of topics. Also, more generally, things like how does the Constitution create identity? This is something that psychologists have lots and lots to say if you can help us think at this kind of level of analysis in terms of those kinds of topics. I would argue, or at least I say I don't kind of engage in those kinds of questions, but if you sort of help us and point us in the direction of these kinds of questions, I think that our research may be quite helpful and fruitful. So just to summarize this point, that critical race theorists, I believe, can help us do two things. Emphasize the importance of broadening our levels of analysis, and two, increase social sciences' understanding of the race-based critiques of legal institutions. Okay, so now I'm going to take the rest of my time to address this second question, which is how might critical race theorists and social scientists together think critically about the utility or the usefulness of empirical data? In short, how useful is empirical data? And so at this point, I really want to take Cheryl Harris and kind of drag her up here with me, because you made a lot of comments before that are very similar to what I'm going to say. And I'm going to say a whole bunch of things about things I don't know a whole lot about. I didn't realize there'd be so many social psychologists in the room, but nevertheless, I've already wrote the talk, so let's just see how this goes. So the question is, how should we be thinking collaboratively? And the first question that I just want to think about is this question of how can we reconcile the issue of empirical data and narratives? And so my sort of naive outside-in understanding is that there's sort of this debate or tension between narratives and storytelling and then legal theories on the one hand and empirical data on the other. And the second question that I'm going to address is, when is data an effective weapon to facilitate social change? And I'd like to sort of argue or present some kind of model suggesting that there's specific times when data is useful and there's specific times when it's not particularly useful, and it's probably systematic. Okay, so this issue of reconciling empirical data, that there is this assumption, not just among legal scholars, but just among all scholars, that data, in particular empirical data, is objective. So that's the first assumption. And a second, that it's impersonal. Second, that data is indeed not narrative, that there are these two different, very different things. And three, and that data is ultimately more effective, that data wins the day. And I think Jerry was kind of pushing this idea a little bit earlier in terms of advancing legal arguments. And so to address the first issue, this assumption that data is objective, I'm going to just sort of point fingers at social psychologists, because that's my own field, that when we look at sort of how our personhood affects our science, approximately 95% of social psychologists are liberal. So when you are writing a law review, you have to sort of put this out there, right? You have to say you're liberal, you have to say you're conservative, and then you go forth and advance your claim, allowing the person who's reading the material to understand your positioning through the lens of your identity. But we don't do that. But nevertheless, there is a very persistent and consistent personhood in psychology, and that is sort of this very liberal kind of personhood. Similarly, there's very interesting data that physics professors happen to be the most religious of all the different kinds of disciplines. And if you look systematically across all the different disciplines, there is a sort of general kind of identity that goes with the science. And so this really leads us to question this issue of, is our data actually objective? And I'd like to sort of suggest that perhaps maybe the personhood doesn't get in the way of crunching the numbers or the statistical significance, but it does inform the kinds of questions that we ask. And so a very simple example of this is that we have this white-black IAT, and that's the very first one comes out because it's very consistent with this idea that there is prejudice out there and it's a dominant group versus the subordinate group. And it doesn't even make sense to have a black-white IAT to sort of point out all the ways in which African Americans or blacks in particular may be prejudiced. It just doesn't quite make sense. So there are theories out there that guide the kinds of questions that we ask. The second is this idea that data is indeed not narrative. I don't want to say that we're just kind of rolling out numbers and telling stories. That's not what I'm going to say. But what I am going to say is that I have had the privilege, and again I'll talk about myself personally, of being trained by what I believe are some of the strongest social psychologists in the country, Claude Steele, Phil Zimbardo, Lee Ross, Mark Lepper, Jennifer Eberhardt, Dick Nisbet from University of Michigan, Walter Mischel, Carol Dweck, and every single one of them has said to me at one time or another that their cachet in the field is their ability to tell a story. Their ability to tell a compelling story. And so when you're reading these science articles, there is a narrative that comes around the data, and that narrative drives how we interpret the results. And so I'm not saying that until I'm just sort of want to put out there this idea that narrative on the one hand and data on the other hand are two completely different chasms of information, and that there's no common knowledge structure in there. Third, and this is going to be the focus of the last bit of my talk, is that data is ultimately more effective to advance legal arguments, and I'm not so sure that that's the case. Okay, so the final question I want to address is, when is data an effective weapon to facilitate social change? And so use weapon to be a bit provocative. And here I want to put forth a model that I've kind of been thinking about that probably has some really elaborated model in legal theory. So I'm just sort of put this out there as an idea, but something that we can have a conversation about. And that's that when there is some kind of contested legal decision that's relevant to race, there's sort of two things that are going to inform whether we actually use this data, whether we believe it, whether we critique it, and the level in which we sort of engage the data. And this is where I sort of, waving at Cheryl here. I mean, Cheryl used Erving Goffman's sort of strategy of thinking about frames, but the way I've been thinking about it is that there's a racial narrative out there. There's a story or stereotypes or framing about how people behave. And then on the other hand, the question becomes, is the data consistent with that narrative? And that these two things together will give us a lot of important information about whether people are going to listen to this information or whether they're going to not. And so I'm going to end with two specific examples. Again, we could probably make this really empirical and look at a content analysis, but I've already sort of questioned that, so let's just go with these examples. So the first example I wanted to talk about is the Greta versus Bollinger. The sort of basic idea is that affirmative action in terms of using quota systems is no longer an argument that can be used, but to the extent that diversity is important and that's a compelling interest, that this can be used in terms of decision making and hiring and so forth. And so some of the data, some of the most important data in that legal case that was harnessed to make this argument is data on the educational benefits of diversity. And a lot of this very interesting research, a lot of it done by Pat Gurin and others, is showing that diversity increases cognitive complexity. So for example, when you have black students and white students all sitting around the table, that white students benefit from minority students. It makes everybody think in more sort of elaborative and complex ways. It improves communication. So diversity is something that is important. And there are over, I don't remember exactly how many, but several hundred studies that have been cited. But this is very consistent with this racial narrative, or this sort of frame out there and this is, I would say, a relatively good frame in the sense that subordinate group members are useful to dominant group members in a pluralistic society, that we have something to offer, that we have a culture, and this culture is a little bit different, and it's interesting, but nevertheless, it's useful. And so these two things are consistent, the racial narrative and the data, and that together sort of increases the effectiveness of the data. Okay, so let's think about a case where the data is inconsistent with the racial narrative, and let's talk about the effectiveness of the data. And so this is some research that I'm going to talk about. This is the crack versus powder cocaine debate. This is sort of one of the hot issues in the 80s, and it's kind of fallen off. Nevertheless, the sentencing related to this is very much still in play now. So it's going to take me a couple minutes to set this up for those of you who don't know some of the data around this. But where I'm going is I want to sort of talk about the racial narrative of race and drugs and danger and who is the menace to society what does the actual empirical data say about the use of crack versus powder cocaine, and then look at the evidence in terms of how effective has this data been in talking and having conversations, or I guess they're not conversations, I guess they'd be legal briefs, with the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Okay, so let me just set this up. The U.S. Sentencing Commission, I believe this was in 1986, I'm not sure if I'm using all of the right legalese, but basically came up with a law that there's a 1 to 100 sentencing ratio between drug traffickers and people who possess crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Okay, so let me break this down, what this means. So if you have a mandatory sentence of 5 years, that is the equivalent to 1 single gram of crack cocaine, which is the equivalent to approximately 100 to 200 doses. So there's probably about 100 people in this room, so you double that, and that's sort of how many doses if everybody just has 1. Not to assume you're all, just go with this, right? Okay, so then 5 years of mandatory sentencing for the form of powder cocaine is the differential. So instead of 1 gram of crack cocaine, it's 5 grams of powder cocaine, which is the equivalent of 10,000 to 20,000 doses. So that's what I mean by 1 to 100 difference in the sentencing ratio. This sentencing ratio was deemed necessary for 3 reasons. First, that crack has a disproportionate danger to society, a danger that has never been seen in our time. Number 2, that it causes violence, that this crack cocaine causes violence in a way that powder cocaine does not. 3, that it has unpredictable and erratic effects, that crack cocaine causes people to behave in ways that are completely unpredictable. And it's an addiction unlike any other drug. And for these reasons, this justifies this disparity in the sentencing. Okay, 2 other things to set this up. So although it is the case that overall, it is the case that whites overall tend to use more crack and powder cocaine than African Americans, there is a disparity such that crack cocaine tends to be more widespread among black Americans and powder cocaine tends to be more spread among white Americans. And the impact of this is that although, in particular, the use of cocaine, crack or powder cocaine, you have 17% of blacks are using it, according to these records, versus 83% of whites. The sentencing is such that 80% of blacks have wound up sort of caught in this sort of sentencing procedure. So a disproportionate number of blacks wind up sort of falling into these sentencing procedures, even though they're disproportionately less likely to use either kinds of cocaine. Okay, so that's the story on the ground. Okay, so that's the story on the ground. Let's look at the data. And there's lots of data out there. So fast forward from 1986, in the past 20 or so years, then there's been all kinds of really important data looking at the physiological effects of crack cocaine. So this is not my area of expertise, but my colleague at Columbia University, Carl Hart, does really fascinating and important work, and many, many people around the country do this. Now, this is nasty stuff, right? Because this is research in which they inject or do self-administration of crack cocaine in the laboratory. So we can have a conversation about the ethics of that, but this is what is the research that happens. And what he does in particular is he studies the physiological effects of crack cocaine. And so on this side here is sort of powder cocaine, and it's called cocaine hydrochloride. And one of the things that his data shows, or what he talks about in terms of what is actually in crack and powder cocaine, is it's essentially the same thing. That what happens in order to get from this powder to, which you can basically in smoke, I think they call it intranasal or something, but you just smoke it, right? And then on the other hand, in order to, you like inhale it versus smoke it, yeah, that's right. Is that what you said? Okay. Well, why do you know that? Sorry. Snort it on the one hand, smoke it on the other.
Never convict.
Let's just hope the tape's not running at this point. In order to turn it into these crystal rocks, you basically add baking soda, you add water, you cook it down, and it becomes this solid form, which actually is a lot cheaper. But essentially, they're both made of the same properties, which is cocaine hydrochloride. So they're not qualitatively different, okay? That's the first point that he talks about. The second point, there's lots of things going on in this data, but I just want to point out one simple point. And this is here on the x-axis is the increase of cocaine doses, and on the y-axis are things like heart rate, systolic blood pressure, and diastolic blood pressure, which is basically just blood pressure. So what this data is telling you is that, yes, crack cocaine is very nasty stuff. The more you smoke it, or the more you, what is that? Crack cocaine you smoke, yes. The more you smoke it, the worse things happen to you. Your heart rate goes up, your systolic blood pressure goes up, and your diastolic blood pressure goes up, and these are all bad. But they go up in a very consistent and predictable way. So the idea that there is this unpredictable effect of crack cocaine, unlike any other drug in our lifetime, is not consistent with the empirical evidence. He actually has other data that I'm not, for a lack of time, not going to show, but basically showing that when you give people the right incentives, alternative reinforcers like cash and money and so forth, in a laboratory setting, it actually reduces the amount that they use crack cocaine in the lab in a very consistent and predictable way. So two very different lines of research published in the very top journals, Science and Nature, Behavioral Psychopharmacology, showing that crack cocaine indeed functions in a very predictable way. Okay, but let's return to this issue of frames and narratives and stereotypes. This data is very inconsistent with the stereotype out there that drugs, and in particular African Americans, they're a menace to society, that they're dangerous and they're criminal. We know that the strongest stereotype out there is African Americans as dangerous. And what I'd like to suggest is that here you have the case where the data, which is very strong and rigorous, is inconsistent with the racial narrative. This data really has been, I would say, almost completely ineffective in terms of changing the law. This team of researchers, as well as several other teams of researchers, have testified to the U.S. Sentencing Commission. They're well aware of this data. There are reports that have come out in 1996, 1997, 2000, and I believe 2003. There's issues saying we need to revisit this. This is difficult. This is complicated. This is wrong. We shouldn't do this. Nevertheless, the sentencing laws, I believe, changed slightly in 2007, but not in any significant way to reduce this impact. And so here is just, I just want to sort of throw out there again, this is just an idea. We could do some kind of systematic analysis to look at different kinds of legal cases, look at the racial narrative that's out there, and look at the data and see whether or not, when the data is inconsistent with the narrative, is it actually used in a court of law or in Congress or the Senate or what have you. Okay, so what I just want to do is I want to just sort of throw that out there on the table, that even the very best of science is only going to be used in very specific ways. And this sort of calls into question or sort of invites a conversation about the use of empirical data that I think is worth having. So here I sort of advance two things. How can we reconcile or think about empirical data versus this idea of narratives, and is this different as we think? And second, when is data an effective weapon to facilitate social change? So to summarize, I tried to address two issues, and this is really fun for me because I never get a chance to stray from my data. So to be able to kind of talk about all kinds of things, I hope my colleagues in social psychology forgive me, but this is really fun to sort of think about, and interesting and important to think about sort of this broader issue of data and the use of data and so forth. And so I talked about the issue of what are the strengths and weaknesses of social scientists, and how can critical race theorists increase our relevance. I also addressed the question of how useful is our data to critical race theorists and legal scholars more generally. And I'd just like to end with the moment in time that I began, which is this Dolph study case. And one of the things that I love to do, I teach research methods. And so I teach undergraduates how to design rigorous experimental social psychology studies, and I love to use the Dolph studies because this is well known, that's not particularly good science. Nevertheless, I also teach a course on the psychology of cultural diversity, and I also use the Dolph studies because I think it's one of the most powerful demonstrations out there about how science can be used to produce social change. And it's a powerful story that's out there. And so I would just like to leave this out for conversation, that this is the level of the conversation that I think we need to be having when we talk about the sort of marriage or the collaboration between critical race theorists and social scientists more generally. So with that, I'm going to say thank you.
So right now, in part, we have 5 minutes for questions, and so I suspect you have lots of questions.
Do you do this long?
Yes. How about yes? Yes.
Okay. So I have a weird background. I did dance studies and I'm doing public administration. So it's a weird background. And one of the problems I see with maybe either activists, practitioners, or policymakers with data is especially data from academia, like the capital letter A, is either connection that sometimes people will have with, they'll connect it to authority, like how it's been inscribed in systems of authority, or they'll think it's irrelevant in some ways. And one of the things I think is a problem with linking up activists with data is, or even like on the ground nonprofit people, is just a resistance to kind of these mechanisms that have also been used sort of in the colonization process, like data has been used by policymakers to do very bad things, and or maybe they see cultural studies as being kind of not relevant, even though it is directly relevant, kind of thing. And so, I mean, I guess part of what I think you're saying, and what I've been thinking about a lot, is how do we translate these messages, sort of like the Obama campaign, because Obama, he won a marketing award of the year, and part of that was, remarketing, putting out these messages in a different way. And I just wonder how academics can kind of work through these divides, people, because I think if people could get the data, it would be very easy to deploy.
I see.
Part of it is looking up with people, and people's reluctance to even, or their thoughts that they can't understand it.
Yep. So that's actually a very good question, and I think the answer, I definitely can't take credit for it. Both my lab manager, Anna Lopez, who listened to this talk very, very late last night, and my PhD student, Ruth Diddleman, both said the same exact thing to me, and they were both in the room at very different times, obscenely early and obscenely late. And both of them said that what we need is a filtration system, that we need some kind of intermediary between the people who are the data analysts, the social psychologists, the political scientists, the economists, and legal scholars, or just people, nonprofit organizations, teachers. I do a lot of work with teachers. They're always using all kinds of data. And that there needs to be a filtration system, sort of a third party who is can be at least somewhat objective, who can not only help understand the narratives out there, but could also understand the good science from the not so good science, as my colleague Dr. Mays sort of was talking about before, and can also talk about what are the good stories, because in a court of law, it's the good story that probably wins the day. So I don't know how you would systemize such a filtration system. I don't know whether it's as simple as having sabbaticals or boot camps, which is something that we've been talking about, where you have social scientists and legal scholars learning each other's work in a more engaged way. That's more than one question.
Community level,
Yeah.
It's not just the
Yes.
officials,
Yes.
It's not just like even the nonprofit executive directors,
Yeah.
It's just like people on the ground.
Yes, but I think that there still needs to be an intermediary, and the web is supposed to do that. But I actually think that the web actually makes data even more complicated rather than less.
So we have time for one more question. Is that okay?
I think that studies of stereotype threat and studies of mismatch have a lot of overlap that we don't quite understand. We can't really separate the effects yet, and we don't quite understand. Or, I think we're missing a lot of information, and I hope that we can have a dialogue about it.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the point that I was making is that we as psychologists, we're not in on that conversation because of the levels of analysis that you and your colleague use versus what we use. And so I'm actually delighted that you're here, and I think it opens this broader conversation about sort of how we use social science data.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time because we're running. Let's give a big round of applause. 5 minutes ready for the next panel. 5 minutes.